focuses on the problems, potential and complexities of mixed streets. And both of these projects take London, where I live and work, as the case. But I think the sort of principles that I'm talking about would be equally applicable here and indeed any other major city. And I'm really focusing on these mixed streets that we've heard so much about this morning from Jane and others, critical streets for our cities, both for their past, the way they grew up, the way we use them today, and for the future of our cities. Now, these mixed streets are high streets by another name, or local high streets, often capture much of the dynamism and perhaps even the sense of excitement of our cities. They're the places that we meet and interact with other people, mixed. There's a whole series of different types of uses. They're often endlessly varied, from the everyday to the exceptional. But they're also places of stark contrasts. Yesterday I was passing people who were sort of passed out on the street through excess of drink, right next to other people who were walking along with some very posh looking shopping bags and so forth, side by side in the same space. And it's exactly the same in London and any other major city. These streets are often the responsibility of many organisations, and because of that, sometimes they get a little bit ignored. That can sometimes be a good thing, because they just get on with it. They have a life of their own, which feeds this dynamism. But sometimes also that can be a problem when we have streets which, as we've seen this morning, are mixed and varied and vital, but are easily destroyed by sort of a failure to think strategically about their future. When we think of these streets, often we have a bit of an idyllic view in our mind. This is a picture of Putney High Street in West London, 1911. Looks like a very civilised place, very nice place to be, a place where we go and do our shopping and meet people and so forth. The reality today is often a little bit different from that, and probably was different from that then. This is the same place today, still full of vitality and lots of things going on. The most polluted street in London, interestingly, Putney High Street. But these streets continue to have this life and diversity of their own, and they adapt and they change, and some things are good and some things are bad. But certainly one thing they have today is this critical relationship between traffic and everything else which goes on there, which can often be a rather negative thing. Now, when we read about these mixed local high streets, often we see two narratives. While some streets continue clearly to thrive in different ways and are places that we go to spend our leisure time and so forth, equally others are written about as places that are in decline and seem to suffer. This is my local high street. Actually, it was my local high street until about a year ago. It's no longer, but it was my local high street. And the main features of my local high street, apart from the traffic, are betting shops and fast food takeaway and estate agents and the occasional Tesco Metro. And that's really what that street now is. It's a combination of those different functions. And there's a big narrative around how these streets are increasingly unhealthy and not good for us in all sorts of ways. So as I said, there's these contrasting views. One is that they're congested, polluted, perhaps even a little bit deprived, dilapidated, inefficient, dirty, ugly, old-fashioned, antisocial. But another is that they're vibrant, inclusive, often loved, full of character, diverse, familiar, social, communal, often talking about the same streets. So what is the real story of these local mixed streets, these high streets? Well, this was the subject of a piece of research a few years ago now, which we did at UCL in conjunction with Gort Scott, who are a small architectural firm in London. It was funded by Design for London, which no longer exists, but was part of the mayor's sort of empire. And this particular first project that I'm going to talk about, the aim was to develop a better understanding and insight into the functioning of these local high streets, and thereby to identify the role of high streets in supporting London's future sustainable growth. So the context for this was the Mayor of London producing a new plan, and as the previous mayor had done, really emphasising the importance of the large brownfield sites, often in quite inaccessible locations, because those are the easy sites to deliver. You know, they're big and a single developer or a couple of developers, and they're sort of relatively easy to negotiate. They deliver lots of goodies in terms of planning gain as well. But they're not necessarily in the most sustainable locations. And so the question was, well, what about the smaller sites? Where are those? Where are they located? And can we think about developing London building on its existing assets, existing street network, rather than necessarily always trying to create new places? We did a lot of literature review, we did a lot of historical and typological analysis. At the heart of it was a series of GIS mapping exercises with readily available data, London-wide data, and then some very detailed case study work of 6 local high streets in London. So we were looking both at the London-wide scale and at the very local scale for our evidence. What and where are London's high streets? Well, if you look at the London plan, then you'd think there are a series of blobs on the map, because these are the locations where it says are the town centres, and often you associate high street with town centre. But of course they're not blobs at all, they're streets. And streets are linear elements, they're not blobs. And if you look at the London A to Z, then you find there's 113 streets which are named either High Street or High Road. And these are those, distributed really across the city. But that's not the whole story, because a lot of roads and streets that are named High Street actually aren't really high streets. They're not any longer high streets in that sort of mixed, fine-grained way. And there are others which are not called High Street or not called High Road. So what we did is we started to map retail. And we decided that to be a local high street, you needed to have a concentration of retail as a basic element. And we decided, rather arbitrarily, that 250 metres of continuous retail was the length. Could have been 300, could have been 400, you take your choice. But at 250, I can't quite remember how we justified that, it was a while ago, we found there was 702 lengths of continuous street, which you might call sort of local high street across London. 700 metres length on average, and 500 kilometres in total. So quite a lot of street you could classify as high street, or these mixed streets. And a feature of them is they're often continuous, they're connective, they connect up the city. They're often, as Jane said, largely unremarkable. They're everyday places. They're often nothing special, but they're mixed and they bind the city together. Many have a very long history, going back almost 2,000 years to when the city came into being. You see the Roman roads, as we heard about earlier on, as the locations where some of this network began. And other arterial roads have been created over the years, and they've been connected up in different ways. So today we have this 500-kilometre network of these very mixed streets. They're sites of rapid and constant change. Even if you look over a few decades, then the sorts of uses, just the retail uses, have changed and continue to change very, very rapidly indeed. And they are truly mixed in the sense that it's not just retail. It's not just about retail. That was the element that we used to define what was one of these mixed streets. But there are all sorts of other uses there as well. And when you start to map that, you find that in London streets, well, at least when we looked at our 6 case studies, we came up with a ratio of 2 to 2 to 1. Retail, office, industrial uses. Still on this network of mixed streets. And residential as well, which wasn't in that ratio. And these are the uses which are within a 200-metre strip of these streets, so that a 1 block depth. That's the critical dimension. A lot of the data that I'll refer to is within that 1 block depth of the actual road itself. Morphologically, they're incredibly diverse, and the way that the different uses, you won't be able to see this, it doesn't matter, you can't see it, it's just to illustrate diversity. The way that the different uses, whatever it is, retail or institutional or educational, relate to the street, each have their own diverse morphologies. And that gives great differentiation in physical character along these streets, as well as in the particular mix of uses. But what is very common to them all is this thin crust of mix, which goes on and on, often for many miles, through the city in different ways, giving this mix, and in the middle is what you might think about as the high street, but it's this crust, this mix, which flows along the street, which gives it so much of that character, and which is continuous. And as we've already heard, there is that depth, or in our research we called it the hinterland behind the shops, which is so important and which is filled with all of these different uses. There's very little of the industrial that you see as you walk along the street, but it's all there, immediately behind the facades, and is part of this rich mix. And, as we already heard, largely invisible when you wander along the streets. It's 500 kilometres, but that's only 3.6% of London's road network. So a relatively small amount of the total road network, but vitally important to the functioning of the city, as we shall see. In fact, we found 1.5 million Londoners work on or within this single block depth of these high streets, outside of the central area. So our research related to the area outside of the city core. But there are more jobs on these streets than there are in the centre of the city. More Londoners are employed. And more businesses are located on these streets than in the central area. But if you look at the London plan, then very much, and local plans, very much the emphasis is all about the centre of the city as a sort of global centre of business and commerce and so forth. But if you think about it in terms of what Londoners do, and I suspect it's the same in most cities, a lot of them are not working here, actually in this complex network of spaces outside of the centre. And a lot of the businesses are quite small and quite dynamic. In our 6 case studies, we found on average about 8.5 employees per business, sites of great innovation, competitiveness, and sustainability, because largely they're people from the locality who are working in local businesses, and they don't have to travel far to get, they can walk to work and so forth. These streets are also places of great character and familiarity and social exchange. They're really important for the local populations who see them as important local resources. Even if it's just betting shops and a Tesco Metro, nevertheless, they remain important to how the neighbourhoods of the city work and the resources that are available to people. And we found, for example, that on our streets, only about 1/3 of the trips to those streets were for shopping. The rest were for a whole series of other things, to go to work, to visit friends and family, for leisure purposes, just passing through to catch the bus or the train and so forth. So often we think about high streets as just being retail spaces, but they're not. They're so much more than that. Places of political exchange as well. And, in London at least, they are part of a sustainable movement network. Only about 1/5 of trips to our high streets, these local high streets in London, are by car. The rest are by walking, by bus, and by other means. I suspect if we repeated this research today, then cycling would be quite a much larger proportion. So this was maybe about 5 years ago, something like that. And cycling has really grown since then. So definitely connected into and part of this larger sustainable movement network, which means if we develop there, then that's also going to benefit from that existing infrastructure. Although, of course, there are some unfortunate side effects of being part of this movement network, not least in terms of pollution. London's a very polluted city. Almost all of London's high streets have concentrations of nitrogen dioxide that are well above safe EU limits, and concentrations of particulates that are well above safe limits. And so people living on these streets are subject to those really difficult issues to deal with major potential health concerns. So that is a problem that needs to be thought about, needs to be dealt with. Perhaps it will change in the future with the move to more electric cars and so forth, but that is a particular issue. What we found when we started mapping London's brownfield sites against these streets was that in fact about half of London's brownfield sites are located within or within a 2-minute walk of these high streets. And I take the point made earlier on by Summit, maybe it was by Jane, about brownfield sites. And brownfield sites aren't just clean brown fields. They're full of all sorts of stuff still, but nevertheless, as an allocated site, about half of them are located on or very close to these high streets. So you could say there's great development potential just by looking at these existing really important places. And you might say that represents a huge existing sunk investment, an investment that in some places goes back 2,000 years and that we've continued to invest in. So why create somewhere new when you've got somewhere already there which has everything needed to support a sustainable lifestyle and is often just waiting for opportunities to be reinvested in. And critically, all Londoners, and it's the same in other cities, have a stake in these places. 2/3 of Londoners live within a 500-metre or 5-minute walk of one of these local high streets. That's 5 million people who think they're important because they're part of their everyday life and the area that they regard as being their home territory. But of course, some of these streets have been suffering, not least in terms of changes to the retail environment and what's happened there, and some of the impacts that that's having on some of our streets. I think London streets, because of the density of population, are more resilient than many cities, but nevertheless you still see some problems. So what are we doing? What are we doing about this? How are these streets being addressed in policy and in action in London? Well, we're not doing a lot, is the answer. Apart from writing reports. There's a lot of reports in recent years about our high streets, not just relating to London, but relating across England and beyond. National policy is not much better. It tends to emphasise just the sort of major town centres. There's been a drive to deregulation, deregulating uses, which I think can be a useful response in some places. If there's not enough demand for retail, then it makes sense to convert it to other uses, whatever that might be, residential or whatever. But in London, we have the particular problem that because there's such a demand for residential, that as soon as you deregulate, almost everything becomes residential, and you'll end up with a city with lots of people living there, but nowhere for us to work. So that's a real problem with deregulation in London in particular, which might, in the long term, undermine some of this vitality, which is so important, both to the city and to these streets. And when we start to look at our plans, both at the London plan, but also at our borough plans, there's 33 boroughs in London, then these streets, these spaces, are often largely invisible, apart from those blobs that you sometimes see on the map. These are the blobs. You can hardly see them here, but these are the blobs. But much of this street network is outside of one of the sort of designated town centres, and therefore nobody's planning for it. Nobody's really thinking about that these are important places that we need to think about and we need to think strategically about. And as I say, what we tend to find when we see these maps is just these sort of rather crude ways of thinking about what is an incredibly complex space. And I think one thing which I think unites all the talks today is this need to understand these complex sorts of places better. And if we understand them better, then we can make better decisions about their future. And that might be just to leave them alone and do nothing. But it might be that we want to intervene in various ways. Perhaps this is because of its complexity. Now, in this particular piece of research, we sort of hypothesized a theoretical framework, if you like, for these streets. And it's very simple, really. All it says is that these high streets are not just sort of lines on a map or blobs on a map. Actually, they're complex bits of physical fabric, which have three-dimensional qualities, as we've seen. But they're also places of movement, part of this network, this sustainable network of public transport, as well as other forms of traffic and pedestrian and cycle movement. But critically also, they're places of exchange, they're places that we meet and we carry out all sorts of different social and economic, political, cultural, community exchange, and they're bits of often very complex real estate owned by many different organisations and people. And it's the interlinkages between those four critical dimensions that is important, but often is very, very complex, and for that reason, often easier to ignore than to try and really understand. In London, there's perhaps two silver linings to this story of neglect. One is that Transport for London, who are responsible for the strategic network of roads in the city, have themselves been on a journey, a journey of enlightenment, and I'll say more about that in the next part of the talk. But they've come to understand that these aren't just places where we need to think about traffic, but actually they are real places where that exchange happens, and therefore we need to think about them in those terms. And even though they're a transport agency, they need to have a broader vision of what these streets are and why they're important to the city. And I think that's a really important journey. There's also recently been quite a bit of investment in our high streets, particularly in the more suburban high streets. There's been various funds which the previous mayor put aside to try and inject some more life into some of our high streets and to turn them from more traffic dominated to less traffic dominated streets. 70 million, 41 million, 50 million in various funds, which sounds like a lot of money. Sounds like a lot. In fact, it's just a drop in the ocean when we think that a single new shopping centre, and there's quite a few of these, Westfield Shopping Centre cost £1.6 billion of investment, or the New Change Shopping Centre in the City of London, which is a tiny little shopping centre, cost 500 million. You know, so these investments by the state are actually relatively minuscule when it compares with the private sector investments which are being made in the city. Well, what about the future? Well, as I've said, London's high streets account for about 3.6% of its road network. They're some of the most important and potentially sustainable spaces of the city. As we've seen, they have huge growth potential, and they have huge significance to Londoners locally, to people who live and work in and around these streets. I would argue that we need to prioritise investment, public sector investment, in this high street network and think about them more strategically as really important assets for the city. But as currently stands, they often languish in this too difficult to handle category. And maybe it's easier to think about these large, easy to develop sites. We need instead a more sophisticated view of what these places are. The street is embedded within a hinterland that feeds and shapes the space, whilst the resulting corridor is continuous and connected, with depth that spreads beyond the thin retail crust. A unifying seam instead of a dividing edge, and a major planning entity in its own right. In other words, instead of seeing it like this, we need to see it like this, where the hinterland is feeding these streets. And these streets are continuous themselves within the city, and they go on and they go on and they go on with this mixed crust, which is so critical to how the city works. So we need a more sophisticated view of these streets. In other words, it's not just this, it's also that. It's the height, what goes on above the shops, but it's not just that either. It's also that, it's that depth as it was referred to, or the hinterland behind the facade, which is so critical to the way these streets work. And it's not just that either, or even that hinterland, but it's the fact that they go on and on, they go on and they go on, often for many miles. And it's understanding that critical, physical, linear element, which is really important. So we need that holistic view that I've talked about, where we recognise them as physical fabric, places of movement, places of real estate, because somebody owns a lot of these properties, and somebody, the public sector, owns the bit in the middle, and places of exchange as well. We need to prioritise investment in the investment that we do make, rather than necessarily investing in the sort of large brownfield sites. Perhaps we should be thinking about these critical spaces for public realm improvements, refocusing civic and cultural uses and community uses on these streets. There's been a programme of many years of moving many of our leisure activities off of these streets into places which you can get to by car, but you can't necessarily walk to. Town halls and libraries and so forth. We need to think about how we can deal with this pollution issue, and maybe that will deal with itself over time as we move to more electric cars, or we reduce the numbers of cars in the city. Perhaps we should think about linear opportunity areas rather than, some of the types of areas that we've seen earlier. And build coalitions of interest, because these are complex places and many organisations, many businesses, many individuals need to be involved in their future. I said there'll be a seamless integration with the next project, and here it is. More recently, we've just finished, hot off the press, another related project, sort of related, which looks at these same streets and questions, if we invest in these places, then what sort of value do they give back to us, to society in different ways? And so the problem here was that the problem that we were looking at was that for many, many years, TfL and others had a network efficiency model of streets. They were interested in streets as places of traffic movement, and they wanted to facilitate as far as possible the efficient movement of traffic through the city, and they weren't too worried about pedestrians or cyclists or anybody else. But as I said already, they've been on a journey, and they've moved from a network efficiency model to a movement and place-based model. So it's not a model that has those 4 dimensions, but at least it has 2 of those dimensions. One is they're still interested, of course, in movement, but they also recognise that the spaces and streets of the city are places for people. And that's been a real transformation in recent years. So this particular project, within that context, was asking what is the value of place-based improvements in street design? What value does that add? Why should TfL, Transport for London, invest in these places? And this sort of work is fraught with all sorts of conceptual challenges and difficulties. It's very difficult to measure the value of the built environment in different ways. Challenges capturing changes to street value over time, and how we can seek to do that, because ideally you'd have longitudinal studies which look at a space over a very long period of time, but often that luxury of time is not available. How do we establish links between design, particular interventions, and the types of value that are then generated? Because there's all sorts of noise in the system, not least the economy, which often gets in the way of making these judgments. How do we make trade-offs between different types of value, between social value and economic value, for example? How do we ascribe tangible types of value to essentially intangible things, those butterflies that were referred to earlier? What value do they have, and how do we measure it? How do we compare different places, given all this complexity that I've described? And how do we select indicators for all of this? Fundamentally, you need a robust methodology to tackle these types of questions. And when you look at the research, what you tend to see is a lot of studies that often take one dimension and try and measure its impact. So, for example, what value do street trees add? There's quite a lot of studies that look at street trees and they say, right, well, if we put a load of street trees down this incredibly ugly street, then what value is that going to add to the people who own those properties? There's lots of studies of that type of nature. But they're quite limited, they're quite specific, and they don't reveal much about these sort of complex spaces that I and others this morning have been describing. So instead we need to think about something that will allow us to measure these places in all their complexity. And here we went back to that same framework that we'd used in the previous study. I said they were linked seamlessly, these two studies. Physical fabric, movement, real estate and exchange. And our thinking was that if we can find different indicators in each of those dimensions and then compare them to each other, it might give us a sense of the impact that making physical public realm interventions has in terms of these different dimensions of value. To do this, we used a method that I've used previously in connection with similar studies a long time ago. We used pairwise comparisons. So a series of streets where we compared a street that had been improved, had significant public realm interventions, against one that hadn't. And these pairs, we chose them in parts of the city that were comparable. Comparable physically, in terms of the type of space that we were looking at, comparable in terms of their socioeconomic profile, comparable in terms of their position on the retail hierarchy, comparable in as many dimensions as possible, so that we could get some sense of what impact the intervention had had. We did 5 pairs of case studies, all of which had had some, well, the 5 improved case studies had had some intervention between 2008 and 2014, often quite significant investments by TfL, fundamentally redesigning the street space, because the intervention needs to be significant enough for us to understand what the impacts are. All of them were these mixed high street type locations that I've described. And we compared their physical fabric. You won't be able to read this, doesn't matter. It's just what this is just showing you that we chose a whole series of different indicators of the physical qualities of those streets. And we devised a simple tool that used these indicators and mapped them against 10 dimensions. Things to see and do, environmental quality, shade and shelter, pedestrians from all walks of life and so forth, that we were able to just measure by going there and observing and seeing how the street worked, and almost sort of a tick box type piece of analysis. We gathered data on real estate, and here we were interested not just in retail but in 3 types of real estate: office, workplaces, retail and residential. And we used different already existing property databases to try and track what had happened over a period of time from 2008 up to 2016 in these different property markets. And they all operate quite independently of each other. So an increase in property prices in one may be reflected very differently in a different market. So you need to understand all of those different markets. We tried to understand movement. We used a series of existing static traffic counts when and where they were available, many of which are done by the Department of Transport, some of which are done by TfL. What you find is, despite the fact that TfL were our clients, this was the most difficult dimension to measure, because a lot of these static traffic counts sort of seem to be quite randomly distributed. They're never where you really want them to be. So the data here is quite imperfect. So we supplemented that with a series of on-site observations where we observed what was happening, what sort of movement was happening in our different case studies, and we compared the improved with the unimproved and so forth. And then exchange in terms of people's social and economic exchange. Well, the best way to try and understand that is to talk to people. So we did a series of on-site interviews with users of the streets and also with local property owners and people that were renting space in the local area to understand their perspective on the street, what had improved, what it hadn't, what works for them, what doesn't, how do they use the street. So what were our findings? And here a bit of a health warning, that a good part of the data that we were using had been collected for other purposes. We were sort of using it for our study, but a lot of it was far from perfect. And we only did 5 pairs of case studies. So this is a sort of toe in the water rather than a definitive study, I think. The headline finding was that in relation to street improvements in the sorts of mixed local high street locations that we investigated, investments in the quality of the street environment return substantial value to street users, occupiers and investors and to their larger areas in multiple ways. So the headline finding is that improvements delivers all sorts of different types of value, which I will tell you what I mean by that. Excuse my images. So some figures. Now, the first one is physical improvements. Using our indicators and our simple on-site tool, we found an uplift in the quality of the space, the perceived quality of the space, of about a third through the physical improvements to the street space alone when we compared the improved to the unimproved. So this wasn't any improvements to the properties along their length. It's simply the public realm. A noticeable improvement in the overall perceived quality of the space. I've got to remember which order these are in. On my computer there's notes. Oh, I can read it here, look. Yes, I'm just going to move this because I've got to remember which order they're all in. In terms of property, we saw a 4% uplift in rental values for office, a 4% annual increase when we compared the improved to the unimproved. That's a fairly significant impact on the office property market. And you might say, well, who wants to have, unless you happen to own an office, who wants to have higher values of office accommodation? Well, in London, one of the key challenges that we have is a lot of the office buildings are being converted rapidly to residential. And unless they deliver a return to the investor, then they will all eventually be converted. So the fact that you can improve and make office investment more viable through the public realm actually does have a positive impact, potentially. And the impact in terms of retail was even more dramatic. We saw in the improved streets an annual increase in retail values of 7.5%. So really dramatic. And largely that was because we found that the retailers really wanted to be in these spaces, and that was reflected in a very significant reduction in vacancy of some 17%. In these improved streets over the unimproved ones. So retailers want to be in nice places that people enjoy using, and it seems really obvious, but until you actually start to put some figures on it, it's difficult to make that case to perhaps policymakers. Interestingly, in the residential area, we found an almost negligible impact. Only 0.25% per annum increase in improved over unimproved streets. And that's in a context where London, property values in London have increased by about 100% in the period that we were looking at. So the impacts of public realm improvements is very small. And often the argument you hear against making public realm improvements is that it's just going to lead to gentrification. Well, our evidence shows perhaps that's not the case, that there isn't a direct impact on the residential property market. 0%. What was that for? Oh yes, traffic. We found no impact on our public realm improvements on the flows of traffic along streets. And that was because most of these, actually all of these improvements had been done without reducing the road capacity. So the amount of vehicles going up and down was exactly the same. In some there was a slight increase in cycling, but the data was rather imperfect in that respect. And that's important as well, because one of the reasons that TfL says they don't want to do this sort of thing is because they're worried that it's going to have a really negative impact on traffic flow through the city. Well, we found that wasn't the case. Really significantly, in terms of the impact on pedestrians and people using the street, we found there was a 94% increase in pedestrian usage in those streets which have been improved over those which hadn't, and a whopping 216% increase in the sort of leisure type activities you do if the place is nice, if it's conducive, like sitting down at a cafe, an external cafe, and having a coffee, or just sitting down on a bench and watching the world go by. A huge increase in those sort of activities. And then when we talk to people about their perceptions of these places, they were really very positive. Those people that could remember the journey, they considered the change to be a real improvement in the character, the walkability, the crossings, allowing them to cross these streets, sitting, and the general vibrancy of these streets were really significant improvements that they valued. Finally, from this analysis, we saw a sort of hierarchy of interventions that you might consider making. The first of which is to focus on reducing the dominance of traffic. And that's not necessarily the amount of traffic, but it's that pedestrians feel more safe. There's larger pavements, for example. They feel able to move up and down the street more safely without the fear of getting run down by traffic. And largely that's to do with slowing traffic rather than reducing the volumes of traffic. So that's the first thing that we need to focus on. And these things, of course, are related. The second thing is enhancements to the physical and social character of the space. So these, just by making the pavements wider, without worrying about the quality of those pavements, you can make a big difference. The next thing is if we start to think about the quality of the space, and that can have an impact as well, but as a sort of secondary factor to that first one. And then finally, the more difficult issue to deal with is this issue around how environmentally clean the space are, dealing with pollution and those sort of issues, and creating adaptable spaces which can change over time. And those are more challenging things to do, and you need to make more fundamental changes to the street to achieve changes there. So we hope that this evidence will be used by TfL and perhaps by others to make the case more decisively for a place-based model rather than this network efficiency model. And as I say, TfL are already on that journey, and I think that's really, really positive. What will these streets look like 20 years from now? Well, I did a Google search, because that tells you everything, doesn't it? And I said, you know, what the future of our high streets? What will the future high street look like? This is one image that came up. Not a very happy sort of image, rather depressing future scenario. Another one was this. Futuristic, but not a single person. Nobody there. So equally depressing. This came up. a sort of high-tech view of retail where we're all going to have drones coming delivering to us, and we have robotic assistants on the high street and things like that. Well, maybe that'll happen, maybe it won't, I don't know. I think this is what's going to happen. That these streets will largely be, as they are today, mixed, vibrant, diverse, offering tremendous value to the city. Certainly in London, they're very adaptable, very robust. That's something, I think, to do with the density of the city. But there are, of course, threats, some of which I've talked about, some issues which are particularly difficult for us to deal with, pollution and so forth. But I think largely we can look at these places as having a really positive future, as long as we plan for them in an intelligent way. And I think we need to do a little bit more of that than perhaps we've been doing in the past. And interestingly, there was a report produced by the UN Habitat a couple of years ago, which really emphasizes the importance of streets for our global prosperity. It says those cities that have failed to integrate the multifunctionality of streets tend to have lesser infrastructure development, lower productivity, a poorer quality of life, social exclusion, and generate inequalities in various spheres of life, access to basic services in particular. Now, the danger with these sort of meetings is you come and you talk to other people who are already committed and think that streets are really important, and we all sit there nodding at each other's presentations, and we go away feeling invigorated. And we've got to convince others that these things are important. But I think there is really a global movement now which suggests that streets are really critical to the way that our cities work, and we need to invest in them, and we need to continue convincing people of that value. If you want to find out more about the first piece of research that I talked about, the second one is not published yet, but the first, if you go to that website and to the publications thing, you can download this paper free, and that will tell you all about the research. Thanks very much.